"You dared touch my dog, you thief!" Harold Fine's scream tore through the air like a slap and hit Riley Grant, who had just pulled the dog out from under a car wheel, leaving her standing in a ring of eyes filled with contempt and suspicion. Before she could get out half a sentence, Officer Brent Koller rushed in, shoved his face close, his breath hitting her skin. "Cut the act. People like you I throw in the car all the time." A punch flew in a burst of shouts, and Riley slipped aside with the instinct of someone trained for combat, a move that froze the whole block because no one realized they had just tried to take down a SEAL carrying a security code in her chest pocket. Only when the radio voice dropped cold as a verdict, "Grant Alpha 7 verify," did the crowd finally understand that prejudice lands fast on the innocent and truth arrives slow like a confession. Do not scroll past this. What happened next shows that abuse of power is never an accident. It starts with the way they choose to look at her. Riley Grant left the covert briefing room less than 10 minutes before she stepped into the corner convenience store. The meeting had moved faster than expected, focused on handing off information and reviewing reporting channels between the Special Operations Unit and Regional Intelligence. She was cleared to use the remaining time to return through a civilian route, so she chose to stop by the nearest store to grab a cold bottle of water to ease the tight dryness in her throat after hours of nonstop concentration. Her civilian clothes helped her blend in the olive bomber resting on her shoulders, the inside lining holding the seal patch and the communication device she had been required to keep temporarily after the meeting. Everything followed protocol, discreet and unnoticed. The glass door behind her had not even closed when Riley saw a small shape dart across the aisle. A tiny dog with golden brown fur shot out from the yard next door and bolted straight toward the street as if chasing a wind-blown leaf. Riley flinched. A motor tricycle had just turned the corner, not out of control, but fast enough to make her heart jump. The dog saw nothing ahead, only ran with its small legs spinning over the sun-baked pavement. Riley reacted with the reflex that years in the military had carved into her body. Still holding the water bottle, she rushed 2 steps toward the animal, bent down and scooped it up right before the front wheel of the tricycle rolled into that spot. The dog trembled in her arms, but burrowed into her chest as if it knew it had escaped danger by inches. Riley gently rubbed its head to steady it. The man on the tricycle glanced over, almost slipping from surprise, then offered a quick thank you before continuing on his way. Riley carried the dog to the sidewalk, intending to see who it belonged to. It wore a small red collar, but no name tag. She glanced around, eyes drifting toward the wooden fence of the nearest house. Maybe the owner was inside, maybe the dog pen had been left open, maybe the small gate in the backyard had not been latched. Things like that were not rare in a quiet neighborhood like this. She had not spoken a word when a sharp shout burst from the doorway of the house on the right. A thin, older man with a furious voice stepped out, his face red as if he had spotted an enemy. He looked at Riley, then at the dog in her arms, then at the street. His gaze jolted with a fear that seemed triggered out of nowhere. Riley had no idea what was happening before he rushed toward the gate. His voice, exploding like fire, dropped into a drum of fuel. "Are you stealing my dog?" The brazen accusation froze her, her eyes narrowing slightly, though she had not yet reacted. Neighbors along both porches began peeking out, some stepping onto their stoops, others stopping mid-watering. The looks they gave Riley carried confusion, caution, and the familiar hint of suspicion she had seen far too many times in her life. Riley held the dog with one hand, her voice steady. It ran into the street. "I only picked it up so it would not get hit." She spoke clearly, neither harsh nor submissive. She knew how to handle basic civilian conflict, especially in a neighborhood that did not lean on reason as much as it leaned on the mood of a group. But old Fine refused to listen. "You dare argue. I saw you carrying it out of my yard. People have said it for years. Strangers stepping onto someone's property always mean trouble." His voice cut sharply as if Riley had broken down his door to steal something. The dog burrowed tighter into her arms at the shout, and the neighbors began murmuring. 2 or 3 faces leaned over from the balcony across the street. A young man propped his bicycle by the curb and raised his phone like he was about to record. Riley exhaled lightly, trying to stay calm. "I picked it up from the road. If it is yours, I am giving it back." She extended the dog forward so Fine could see it better, hoping he would recognize how unreasonable his accusation was. But the more Fine looked, the more he slipped into attention he did not need. "Give it back. You think that fixes anything? I called the police and they are on their way. You stay right there and explain it to them." He stepped back inside after saying it, the door slamming so hard Riley felt the glass shake. Seconds later, the click of the lock sounded like a final verdict that he truly saw her as a thief. Riley stayed where she was, the dog trembling in her arms from all the noise. She kept her tone gentle, her free hand stroking its back to help it feel safe. The whispers were not loud, yet heavy enough to thicken the air. People still stood several steps away, but that distance felt heavier than a concrete wall. Not even half a minute passed before the distant crackle of a police radio sounded. A few bystanders turned toward the road leading to the main street. A firm voice came through the short speaker, each word clear. "Code 45. Suspect shows signs of resisting on approach." Riley heard it plainly, her eyes narrowing. She knew this was the moment things could turn bad if handled wrong. She looked at the dog in her arms, then at the eyes converging on her. She was used to standing alone in strange places and being misunderstood, but this time felt worse because everything had started from a simple act of kindness. A strange instinct flickered in her chest. What was coming would not stop at a small misunderstanding, and at that moment the sound of patrol wheels halting at the end of the block began what she knew would be trouble far bigger than returning a dog. Riley heard the patrol wheels stop at the end of the block and instantly felt the shift in the eyes around her. The tension that had already thickened under Fine's accusation now congealed as people silently decided which side the police would take. The dog stayed curled into her trembling, and Riley held it close to her chest on instinct. She reminded herself to stay calm, because this kind of moment could slide from misunderstanding to confrontation with almost no warning. Brent Koller stepped out of the patrol car with the look of someone convinced every situation needed immediate control. His uniform was crisp, his boots polished, his eyes sweeping the street as if hunting for a conclusion he had already reached. His hand rested on his gun belt, not drawn but anchored there like a warning. His stance made several bystanders edge back, creating a loose circle that turned Riley into the center of an unwanted state. Brent's gaze landed on Riley for barely 2 seconds, yet it carried suspicion from the start. He did not ask a question, only nodded toward Harold Fine, signaling for the caller to speak first. Harold stepped out as if waiting for that cue, his breath uneven, his face flushed with anger and fear. "I saw her carrying my dog into the shadows," he said loudly, his voice mixing certainty with defensiveness. He ignored the fact that Riley stood in plain sight at the curb. To strengthen his claim, he pointed at her, then at the pavement, as if presenting undeniable evidence. Brent gave a short nod and looked back at Riley with sharper eyes as though he had just been handed proof. A woman across the street spoke up. "I saw her near the fence earlier," she said, her voice not loud but clear enough for Brent to hear. She did not sound sure, more pushed by the crowd than by what she actually saw. Even so, her words became another brick, reinforcing the wall of bias Brent had already built. Riley felt the situation slipping beyond her control. She kept her tone steady, trying to explain in a way that someone reasonable could follow. "I picked the dog up from the street so it would not get hit. I did not enter anyone's yard." She held the dog forward so Brent could see it. "I do not know whose house it came from. I only pulled it out of danger." Brent showed no sign of considering her words. It was clear he trusted Harold's version over anything Riley said. His mouth tightened as if her calmness itself was some clever form of resistance. He stepped closer, leaving only enough space for their breaths to overlap. His hand stayed fixed on the gun belt, and his eyes scanned her face with the fixed belief that she was the problem he had arrived to solve. Riley kept her gaze steady without looking defiant or arrogant. She only wanted to clarify the situation so it could end quickly, but Brent's few seconds of silence tightened the air like a wire about to snap. Harold continued piling on as if trying to push Brent into using force. I warned, and she still held the dog and ran. She was clearly trying to take it somewhere. "My kids play with that dog every day. They will cry all day if it is gone." He spoke without feeling the slightest weight of turning an innocent person into a suspect through a story he had invented. Riley felt her shoulders tense. She sensed the dog's breathing, the neighbors, and the strain in Harold's voice. She knew this type of situation was never simple, especially when a false accusation could push an officer into pressure and misjudgment. She spoke again, this time more firmly. "I did not run. I have been standing right here since I picked it up from the street." He saw wrong. Her voice was not loud, but the weight behind it carried the truth she was stating. Brent raised an eyebrow. In his eye, Riley saw something shift. Her calmness made him think she was hiding something. The enforcement mindset he relied on made him watch her smallest motions rather than listen to her words. He looked at Riley's hand as she adjusted her grip on the dog, a simple move meant to comfort the animal, but in Brent's mind it became a sign of preparing to flee. He knew nothing of body language, and the shift lasted 1 second at most, enough for him to form his own conclusion. Riley noticed the change but did not yet understand where it would lead. She only saw Brent take one hard step closer, his foot hitting the ground as if marking control of the space. Suddenly, Brent thrust his free hand forward and shoved Riley's shoulder. The unexpected push sent her back half a step, the dog letting out a small cry. The crowd gasped, unsure whether out of fear, shock, or anticipation. Riley held her balance, but understood this was no longer a simple exchange. One small shove, delivered by someone with authority, could trigger a chain of events she did not want. Instantly, she realized the situation had slipped beyond reason and had entered a place where Brent's instinct would decide everything. The moment Brent shoved Riley still echoed in the crowd's reactions. Some people drew closer to one another, their faces tight curiosity mixing with the fear that something was about to slip out of control. The dog trembled in Riley's arm, its round, wet eyes lifting toward her, as if sensing the air thickening around the two of them. Riley held her balance and tilted her head slightly to show she had no intention of responding with force. She took a breath, trying to pull the situation back to its starting point before it turned into one of Brent's impulsive choices with consequences that reached too far. "I saved it from a car," she said, each word slow and clear, heavy enough that any reasonable person would reconsider their assumptions. Brent narrowed his eyes, his stare sharpened like a blade freshly honed, fueled by overconfidence and a need to prove authority. He stepped in, half a pace, shrinking the space between them more than necessary. "You saved it," he repeated, his voice steady but tight like steel wire. "Or were you trying to steal it? I have seen plenty like you." Riley had heard that line before in her life, but the way Brent said it hit her chest like a clamp. It was a sentence dropped like a verdict with no need for evidence. A few people behind Brent exhaled softly as if given one more reason to believe she was the villain. Their eyes fixed on her with caution, even though none of them had seen her do anything wrong. A middle-aged man at the corner lifted his phone camera pointed toward Brent. His action pulled a few more phones up. Collective instinct in quiet neighborhoods always worked this way. Once things escalated, they wanted proof or simply something to post to show they had been present. Brent noticed the recording. His face changed instantly energy, annoyance snapping past the line of control. He turned sharply and pointed at the man with the phone. "Turn it off," he barked, his voice echoing across the street. "Obstructing an officer." His tone startled the man, whose hands fumbled as he hesitated. A woman nearby shot a furious look at Brent. Others stepped back 2 or 3 paces, forming a wider circle, wanting to watch, yet maintain safety. Riley did not look away from Brent. She felt the familiar rhythm of a false accusation being used to force someone into weakness. She had seen these looks in many settings, from the field to training yards, but here it carried a civilian edge that she knew could be the most dangerous, driven by emotion rather than reality. Brent turned back to Riley, his eyes carrying both certainty and challenge. "What else are you going to say now?" he asked, though his tone pushed rather than questioned. His steps came so close that Riley had to lean slightly aside to keep space. She let out a quiet breath and answered clearly, "I did nothing wrong." Her voice stayed calm but colder than before, because she knew gentleness was often mistaken for weakness by someone intent on asserting control. Brent looked her over again, searching for anything that might prove him right. The small dog began to whine, and Riley shifted her hold to comfort it. The movement made the edge of her bomber jacket slip a little. She lifted a hand to straighten it, a simple act meant only to cover the inside lining pocket. She did not think twice, because to her it was instinctive to fix clothing that had shifted. Brent did not see it that way. The moment Riley's hand rose to adjust the jacket, Brent's eyes widened, reacting as if he had caught a threat. He lunged forward, his voice tight with tension and a hint of paranoia. "You are pulling something from your jacket." The words tore through the silence that had settled over the crowd. A woman screamed, convinced Riley really had something dangerous. Several others stumbled back, clutching their children or grabbing onto each other. Whispers swirled like a spreading gust, pushing Riley deeper into a ring of suspicion. Riley flinched at Brent's sudden outburst, her eyes widening not from fear but from realizing how fast the situation was spiraling into a tunnel of misunderstanding she could not control. Her heartbeat quickened, not because she felt threatened, but because of the sheer unfairness pressing down on her. She knew she had not pulled anything, had not made a threatening move yet. Brent was ready to twist her simple adjustment into proof of resistance. Brent stepped in even closer, his hand tightening on the gun belt as if ready to draw. His breath hit Riley's cheek, charged with the impatience of someone trying to force reality into the shape he wanted to believe. His eyes locked on hers, searching for a justification to turn an innocent gesture into danger. This misunderstanding was no longer just a mistaken claim. It had become a pivot point, heavy enough to pull the entire incident toward violence. The crowd had not fully sensed how dangerous the shift was. They only clustered around, watching, unsure what to do. Riley kept her gaze steady, tilting her head slightly to gain a sliver of space from Brent. She knew any sudden move would escalate things, yet she also recognized that Brent was beyond reason. He was looking at her with the intent to impose a conclusion, not hear one. In that moment, Riley understood she was standing at the start of a chain of events that Brent himself would ignite, and it would draw reactions no one here could predict. The path had turned toward danger, and Brent's misunderstanding had become the first spark in a test she hoped to endure, though she doubted the crowd would stay calm long enough to see the truth. The tension between Riley and Brent spread across the street like heat rising off the pavement. The small dog in Riley's arms was still trembling, its round eyes darting around, while the crowd had stretched into a circle, forming an unwilling state. Uneasy, curious, and doubtful eyes locked onto the two facing each other. Every breath seemed held as Brent watched Riley with the certainty of someone who intended to control everything through force. Brent stepped closer, his body leaning forward. His voice dropped but lost none of its threat. Keep your hands where I can see them." The tone was not a warning but a trap, as if the slightest move would justify whatever reaction he had already planned. Riley met his stare. She recognized his voice not as someone trying to resolve a situation, but as someone searching for a reason to turn it physical. She tilted her head slightly, arms still holding the dog close. "You are assuming things," she said, the words slicing through the heavy air around them. The moment she spoke, Riley saw Brent's shoulder jerk. The shift in his eyes was sharp and immediate, as if her words hit something he tried to hide under the veneer of authority. Annoyance flashed, then vanished, replaced by a decision Riley knew could not be undone. His fists tightened his shoulders, loading with tension like a wire pulled to its limit. Brent said nothing more. He launched a punch at Riley's chest with the speed of someone trained to strike in high-pressure encounters. The punch had little technique but carried the weight of blind confidence. The crowd gasped, some exhaling sharply, some lifting their hands to their mouths in shock. But the punch never landed. Riley moved with instinct shaped by years and special operations. A slight shift of her shoulder, a step to the right, a lean that redirected momentum, and Brent's fist cut through empty air. Her speed was so sharp that several people could not track it, only seeing her slip out of the strike as if she had anticipated it. Brent stumbled half a step forward from the missed hit. His eyes widened for half a second, surprise etched across his face, as though the idea of Riley dodging had never even crossed his mind. In his view, a woman holding a dog on a sunny afternoon should have backed away or fallen. Instead, she avoided the punch with ease, leaving him stunned by something his assumptions had not prepared for. Riley stepped back, still holding the dog securely. The animal was frightened, but she kept her breathing steady to calm it. Her eyes darkened, not with anger, but with the sharpness of someone who understood her opponent was trying to drag the moment toward a dangerous edge. She knew that if she did not control her own emotions, the situation could slip beyond anything she could still manage. The noise around them swelled. A man in the back shouted in shock. She dodged it. A woman near the fence clutched her chest. My God, she moved so fast. The words hit Brent's pride like needles, and his stare shifted as he glanced around before locking back on Riley, as if what he had just seen only confirmed she was a threat. The dodge convinced Brent that Riley had training. Instead of making him reassess it, pushed him further. He looked at her as if she were hiding a dangerous identity, as if her speed were proof of defiance. No one in the crowd dared step forward, keeping their distance, while whispers blurred into a thick layer of noise. Some people retreated into their homes, others raised their phones higher, and a few murmured that things were getting out of hand. Riley did not want the confrontation to stretch any longer, but she knew Brent was losing control. She kept her shoulders square, eyes steady on him, while her mind searched for a way to de-escalate. Her gaze was not rebellious, but its clarity made Brent feel challenged. He dragged in a heavy breath, his face flushing with humiliation and anger over the missed punch. He stepped forward again, his foot hitting the pavement with a short, sharp thud, signaling that he would keep going if Riley made even the smallest move. Riley tilted her chin slightly, trying to stabilize the moment. The dog in her arms let out a soft, pleading sound. Her heartbeat stayed steady, her body ready for thwarts it, even though she did not want to respond with force. Brent lifted his hand as if preparing another strike, his eyes flashing with the aggression of someone convinced he had the right to act. But this time, the crowd had seen enough to recognize how unreasonable he was. An older man shook his head and muttered, "What is he doing?" She did nothing. Brent heard it. He clenched his jaw, his eyes boring into Riley as if searching for justification. But the image of her clean dodge lingered in the minds of the onlookers, and in that moment, everyone realized they were witnessing something far more serious than a simple misunderstanding. Riley stayed still, her gaze calm but sharper now. The confrontation had moved past words. She understood that from here on even the smallest motion could trigger something harsher from Brent, and everyone stood waiting to see what would happen next, as truth, prejudice, and instinct hovered in the same space, ready to erupt again without warning. The moment Brent's punch cut through empty air and Riley slipped aside with the reflex of someone trained, the space in front of the convenience store seemed to lose all sound. The breeze across the pavement, the crunch of shoes on gravel, the sharp breaths of the onlookers. Everything dropped as if someone had turned the world's volume down. Riley held her balance after the shift, the dog curling tighter against her chest. She did not overreact, did not raise her hands to guard, did not search for an escape. She simply steadied her breathing and kept her heartbeat controlled, grounding herself in the center of the tightening circle of eyes that felt like an invisible blade. The crowd fell silent for a beat. They had never seen anyone dodge a punch so cleanly or so fast, especially without warning. Their eyes bounced between Riley and Brent as they tried to make sense of what they had witnessed. No one spoke at first, and that quiet freeze made the air feel heavier. Then, a seasoned voice broke through, deep and clear enough to pull every gaze toward it. That is not a civilian reflex. The speaker was Marcus Hale, a veteran of 2 battlefields who now lived at the end of the row. He stepped from his porch slowly, one hand on his cane, but his back straight, his eyes steady despite the tension. He looked at Riley as if he had just recognized something important. The sharp intuition of a man who had lived where every step could cost a life gave his words the weight of a truth no one could dismiss easily. A few onlookers exchanged glances, their suspicion fading. A woman whispered that the dog looked exactly like what books described in soldiers. A younger man muttered that if Riley could move like that, she was unlikely to be doing anything shady. But others reacted the opposite way. A young man crossed his arms and insisted that if she had trained reflexes, that only proved she was dangerous, and Brent needed to act harder. A woman beside Harold nodded and whispered something to him, then stared at Riley as if expecting a hidden weapon. Marcus scanned the crowd, his gaze stopping on those drifting toward Brent's side. "What did you see?" She held the dog and stayed still the whole time. The way she moved, I have seen it hundreds of times in people who went through harsh training. Harold grumbled, trying to force himself into the moment. Training or not, I saw her acting suspiciously the second she stepped out the door. He spoke without looking at Riley, as if arguing with his own fear rather than the fact. Brent heard every word, but his reaction was entirely different. His face dropped for a brief instant. The surprise from Riley's dodge twisted into embarrassment, then into anger. The looks from the crowd, especially from those beginning to question his actions, made him feel challenged, as if someone had torn away the confidence he used to dominate every situation. He turned toward Marcus. "Step aside. I am handling a suspect." Marcus leaned on his cane and stepped forward. I saw her stand still. "I saw you strike first." Brent let out a short, sharp laugh, brittle as glass. "You think you know everything? People like her I see all the time. They pretend to be victims, then attack the second I lower my guard." The crowd stirred again, 2 sides forming more clearly. One group looked at Riley with sympathy, the other with suspicion, as if she had been revealed as something dangerous they could not fully understand. Riley kept her voice steady even though she felt Brent edging toward violence. "I am holding a dog, and I have been standing here since you arrived. You are writing a script in your head." Some people nodded at her words. A woman murmured that if Riley planned to run, she would have done it already. A young man, filming, whispered that her dodge was impressive, but obviously defensive, not aggressive. The more reasonable her stance appeared, the redder Brent's face became. He could not stand the crowd beginning to look at him with judgment. He leaned in toward Riley, his accusatory stare sharp enough to feel like a blade. "You think you are smarter than me. You think dodging one punch makes you strong." His voice dropped, each word heavy. "You are pushing yourself into something big." Riley kept her chin level, her eyes fixed on him. "I just avoided being hit." The line struck Brent's pride like a spark on dry fuel. Thick silence fell across the street. Then everything moved too fast. Brent lunged. Without warning or thought, he threw himself at Riley as if trying to crush the doubts forming around him. The dog panicked, and Riley had to twist her body to keep it safe. Brent's charge had no finesse, but carried raw force, the kind used by someone relying on instinct rather than training. The crowd gasped all at once. Some shouted warnings, and Marcus slammed his cane on the ground, his eyes wide. In the instant, Brent reached toward Riley, his hand poised to grab her throat or shove her to the pavement. Everyone understood this was no longer a simple misunderstanding. This was the moment the situation tipped into real violence. Riley tightened her hold on the dog, her eyes flashing with the reflex of someone who had faced danger before. In the next breath, everything would shift in a way no one watching could predict. The moment Brent lunged and forced his hand down, Riley twisted on instinct, trying to keep the dog from being crushed. But Brent had already crossed a line no officer should cross. He grabbed Riley's arm and wrenched it behind her with enough force that her shoulder gave a small crack. A second later, his knee slammed into her back, driving her onto the burning pavement. The dog slipped from her arms, rolled to the side, and barked in panic. Riley clenched her teeth as pain shot through her wrist and shoulder nerves firing under the pressure. Her breath hitched her chest, pinned by Brent's weight, but her eyes, when she glanced sideways, stayed cold as steel. "You will pay for this," she forced out between cut breaths, her voice low and tight from deep in her throat. Her stare locked onto Brent, not as a threat, but as the warning of someone who had lived where one wrong decision could cost a life. Brent heard, and his anger exploded like fuel catching flame. He twisted her wrist harder and pressed more weight through his knee, making her breath constrict. He was no longer thinking, driven by humiliation over the missed punch and by the judgmental eyes surrounding him. Riley drew in the small, strained breaths, her body adjusting to conserve energy under the crushing pressure. She knew any sudden move would only convince Brent she was resisting, and she forced her mind to stay clear while her back and neck were shoved nearly flat to the ground. The crowd erupted in shock. A woman screamed, "Stop! What are you doing?" A young man stepped closer with his phone, his hand shaken in fear and anger. Through the rising shouts, Marcus Hale slammed his cane against the pavement, the crack of wood on concrete slicing through the noise. He moved faster than his usual gait, his face shifting into the cold resolve of someone who had witnessed wrongful force on real battlefield. His eyes locked onto Brent's hold, the angle of the arm, the weight on Riley's spine, the way she turned her neck to breathe. "Stop!" Marcus roared louder than anyone else. "The way she is bracing, I have seen it in combat." He stepped closer, close enough that Brent had to glance up. But Brent's eyes were filled with defensiveness, as if Marcus were threatening his authority. "Back off." Brent snapped, breath ragged. Marcus did not move. His face stayed still. "You are wrong. She never attacked you." Marcus tightened his grip on the cane. The stance made several people behind him hold their breath because they knew he had been a real soldier, and he would not use that voice unless he was certain of what he saw. The moment Riley lifted her head to draw in a bit more air, the pressure in her lungs blurred her vision. Dust clung to her cheek, her wrist pulled to the edge of sharp pain. She felt clearly that Brent was forcing her toward a loss of control so he could claim a reason to restrain her and drag her anywhere he wanted. A man in the crowd shouted, "He is going to break her arm." A woman covered her mouth in horror. A young man stepped back several paces, overwhelmed. The chaos only made Brent push harder. He shot Marcus a defiant look, then turned back to Riley. "Resisting, huh? You want me to haul you straight to the station?" His voice ripped through the air, fueled by fury and the feeling of being challenged. Riley gritted her teeth, her breath fractured, but her gaze did not waver. She said nothing, not from weakness, but because she knew speaking now would push Brent further. Marcus stepped in 2 more strides, his face lined with anger and real concern. You press her wrist like that again and you break protocol, Marcus said, his voice low but sharp, carrying the authority of someone who once led soldiers. She is face down, pinned with no chance to resist. You are abusing your power. Brent did not listen. He lowered his weight and drove his knee deeper into Riley's back as if trying to prove Marcus wrong. A strained breath forced its way out of Riley as her chest compressed under the pressure, making air harder to draw. Her whole body was pressed to the ground, her eyes the only part untouched by Brent's force. The crowd erupted again. Let her go. You are choking her. Stop, for God's sake. The small dog ran in frantic circles, barking as if trying to protect Riley. Some people tried to grab it for safety, but it broke free each time its eyes locked on Brent. Marcus raised his cane not to strike, but to show Brent he was no longer a bystander. I said it, Marcus thundered. That is a suppression hold. You are choking an unarmed woman. Brent clenched his jaw, turning on Marcus while still crushing Riley's wrist. You take one step, and I will haul you too. He growled each word, pushed out in hot bursts. Riley tried to turn her neck to pull in more air. Heat from the pavement burned her skin, her throat stung, but her eyes stayed fixed on Marcus, a silent signal that she was still conscious. Years of training reminded her she could not panic because one sharp movement was all Brent needed to escalate his use of force. The crowd trembled with rising noise. A young man shouted, "Someone call more police!" A woman hurried to pull out her phone, snapping photos with shaken hands. An older man near the fence muttered that Brent had crossed the line. The air felt strangled. Riley's body was pinned down. Brent pressed harder, and Marcus was on the verge of taking another step to stop something worse from happening. Just before he could move, Brent tightened his grip on Riley, the force sending a sharp jolt through her shoulder. He yelled the final words, cut and harsh and violent, through the street, resisting. You want me to drag you to the station right now? That instant became the boundary before the next eruption, a moment the entire crowd could feel even before it happened. Brent kept his knee pressed hard into Riley's back, the weight crushing her breath and burning her throat with every inhale. The pavement beneath her cheek carried dust and heat, but her eyes stayed sharp and aware. The crowd's shouts crashed together into a chaotic roar, everyone realizing this had gone far beyond a simple misunderstanding. The small dog circled her, frantically barking as if trying to pull her free from the force grinding into her spine. Brent yanked Riley's arm tighter, and the pull shifted her bomber jacket sharply to one side. The fabric flipped open, and from the inner lining a strip of black patch appeared under the sunlight. Even though most of it stayed hidden, the texture and shape were recognizable to anyone who knew what they were seeing. Riley felt Marcus's gaze sharpen like an arrow as he caught sight of it. A breath later, he stepped closer, his brows tightening. Marcus stared at the exposed patch, memory snapping back to his years in service. That lining, I have seen it on SEAL gear, he said, his voice low and weighted, dropping like a stone into the already boiling air. Several people gasped, turning to look closer, trying to gather every detail their eyes could reach. Murmurs rose again, this time filled with real questions rather than blind accusations. Brent glanced at Marcus, but the confidence in his eyes faded. He tried to brush off Marcus's words, yet Riley could feel the pressure of his grip falter even as he tried to hold firm. "SEAL, here, come on!" Brent snapped, his voice tight with irritation as if denying what had been spoken. Still, a few people began eyeing Riley differently, noting that the patch was no store-bought decoration. As Riley shifted slightly to ease the strain on her shoulder, the inner pocket of her jacket opened wider. A small, dark device, metallic and compact, slid halfway out before catching at the edge of the lining. It did not fall, but it protruded enough for anyone nearby to see. Marcus's posture changed instantly, his face freezing as he recognized the shape of a military encrypted comm unit. A sudden silence spread through the crowd like a wave. Marcus stepped closer, stopping only a few paces from Brent. "That device is not civilian," he said, his voice low but cutting. "You are restraining a military operative." The crowd erupted in startled whispers, a few people covering their mouths, others turning to one another in disbelief. The divide between opinions shifted sharply as the truth revealed itself on the asphalt right in front of people who thought they had understood what was happening. Brent pulled his thoughts back for a beat, but he clung to his earlier certainty. "She is hiding something, which means I hold her tighter," he said, though his voice had lost its edge. Riley noticed the flicker of confusion behind his eyes, but it was not strong enough to pull him away from the force he was using against her. She steadied her breath, fighting the pain running from her shoulder down her back as she searched for the smallest space to move. A man in the crowd spoke up, his voice shaky but heavy with doubt. "She really has military equipment." A woman beside him whispered quickly, her eyes locked on Riley. "Now I understand how she dodged so fast." The words slipped through the air and dug into Brent's uncertainty. People began looking at him differently, no longer fully buying the story he had built around Riley. Before Brent could respond, the radio on his shoulder crackled and came alive. The voice that emerged cut through the unstable air like a blade. "Priority code, Grant Alpha 7, verify." Several people jerked their heads toward him. Some repeated the words under their breath, as if unsure they had heard correctly. Brent froze for a moment, his eyes widening as though he had been struck in the center of his chest. He heard the name Grant, clearly matching it to the woman pinned beneath him. What chilled him more were the words Alpha 7, a designation he had never heard used in any civilian setting. The crowd's eyes shifted toward Riley, still pressed against the pavement, her gaze steady in a way that felt out of place. The radio repeated the call, the voice firmer and sharper. "Grant Alpha 7, verify." This time, no one dared breathe loudly. Those recording widened their eyes and others stepped back as if they had just wandered too close to something far larger than they understood. Riley closed her eyes for half a second, grounding herself. She knew this was the pivot, the moment the entire situation would turn in a direction she no longer controlled. What she had worked to keep hidden had surfaced not by her choice, but because Brent's force had exposed it at the exact moment no one expected. And in that suspended second, the entire street felt something different, sweeping in a wave no one could predict the weight of. Only Riley Grant knew that from here nothing would return to the way it was. Brent's radio kept transmitting the dispatcher's voice, cutting through the air stretched tight as a drumhead. The entire street fell silent, no one understanding why a patrol officer was receiving a classified code calling out the exact name of the woman pinned beneath him. Brent stayed in position, but Riley felt the slight tremor in his body when the signal repeated a third time. He turned his head, staring at the exposed patch under her shifted jacket, then at the comm device in the inner lining. The certainty in his eyes cracked wide. Riley steadied her breath, her throat burning from the pressure she had endured for what felt like a long minute. She knew it was time to answer the verification call, and if she let it repeat again, the system would escalate into high alert. Someone with her operational background understood every step of that protocol. She drew in a deep breath, turned her head just enough to speak clearly, and said, "Grant Alpha 7, confirm." Her voice was hoarse and broken by force, but clear enough for everyone nearby to hear. Some people covered their mouths, others recoiled, all realizing they were witnessing something far beyond Brent's authority and far beyond the scale of their quiet neighborhoods. Riley closed her eyes for a second, feeling her heartbeat expand in a brief release, as if she had just stepped back from the edge of a blade. The radio responded immediately, the dispatcher's tone shifting into strict command. "Verification complete. Contact Lieutenant Colonel Reed. Priority Level 1. The words pulled the whole scene tight like a held breath. Brent shifted to the side, eyes wide. In local policing circles, the name Reed was not unfamiliar, but having a military lieutenant colonel cut straight into his radio on a public street was something he had never imagined. Confusion showed in every movement. Brent looked at Riley, then at the crowd as if everything was slipping past him faster than the voice from the radio. Riley tried to lift her shoulder under Brent's knee. Pain shot through her wrist, but she said nothing. Her deliberate stillness only unsettled Brent more, as though she were silently proving he had misread everything from the very beginning. The crowd split into two clear lines. Some worried for Riley, others stepped back to avoid being pulled into a situation spiraling on a live stream. His camera swept across every reaction, every whisper, every shift on Brent's face. With each passing second, the viewer count on his phone climbed. The radio crackled again, sharper this time. Regional units en route. Maintain the scene. A short siren burst echoed from the corner. Not the long wail of a chase, but clip priority tones used by upper-tier patrol units. The vehicles carried no military logos, only special plates. The crowd jolted. Only a few understood that Reed had likely called the regional police directly, instead of sending military transport following protocol, yet moving faster than anything Brent could anticipate. The first car stopped at the curb. The door swung, and the regional captain stepped out, two officers behind him. He did not look at the crowd, only at Brent, then at Riley, pinned beneath him. His expression darkened when he saw the shifted jacket and the exposed comm device. "Brent Koller," he said, his voice dropping like stone. "Release her. Now." Brent froze. "Captain, the situation. Release her," the captain repeated, cold as a cut, leaving no room for argument. Brent pulled his knee away as if snapped from a trance. Riley inhaled hard, rolling to the side to reclaim her breath. As she pushed herself up, the tendons in her arm stood out from the sudden release after the crushing minutes. The captain stepped closer and knelt beside her. "Are you seriously injured?" he asked. Riley answered in a low, tired voice, "I am fine." He rose and moved toward Brent. His face shifted as if someone had said a verdict in front of him. The crowd held its breath when he leaned close to Brent and spoke low, yet clearly enough for those nearest to hear every word. "You just assaulted a SEAL commander." The words hit like a heavy boulder. Brent staggered half a step back, his face drained, his lips trembling as though he had just heard his own indictment. Eyes around him drilled into him, reconsidering every moment under a new light. Those who had trusted Brent early on looked stunned, and those who had sided with Riley stood silent, knowing everything from this point would turn in a completely different direction. Riley drew another breath, feeling the shift in the air around her. Her pulse had steadied, but her mind stayed sharp, tracking every movement from Brent and every whisper. She sensed him searching for an answer, but his mouth only quivered without sound, fear rising through his throat like cold water. The captain signaled the two officers behind him. One stepped forward to collect Brent's radio, the other confirmed Riley's identity under the high-priority protocol Reed had issued. The crowd watched in complete silence. Brent's face showed pure disorientation caught between shattered pride and a tight, speechless fear. He realized the worst part was not the disciplinary action coming for him, but that the entire ordeal had unfolded in front of people he had long assumed he could command. In that instant, Riley saw something different in his eyes, something far from his earlier arrogance. A small hollow of collapse, and she knew everything was only beginning. Brent stood frozen for a few seconds after the captain's words. The whispers behind him rose like a stirred wave. He looked at Riley, then at the comm device exposed from her inner pocket, his eyes widening with confusion he could no longer hide. His breath came heavy and not from exertion, but from the panic of realizing he had crossed a line he never imagined. What he thought was authority now crashed back onto him as a weight. He stepped back half a pace, his voice bursting out so fast it caught in his throat. "I did not know," Brent stammered. She was not in uniform. Each word sounded like a plea, but fear hid under every syllable as if he were grasping for any excuse left to shield himself. His hands opened and clenched repeatedly, his body stiff under the pressure. The captain stared straight at him, his gaze unmoving. "She came from a classified briefing. Civilian clothing is protocol." He spoke each word clearly without raising his voice, yet with enough weight weight to settle over the entire scene. People around them heard it and shifted their eyes toward Brent, their earlier trust gone. Some frowned, others replayed the footage they had recorded to confirm they had witnessed everything from the start. Brent shook his head hard as if refusing to accept what he had been told. She resisted. He shouted, his voice rising from tension rather than authority. She did not comply. I warned him, and she still did what she wanted. His face flushed partly with anger, partly with the feeling of being cornered as the truth surfaced. His words made some people step back, sensing how desperation was peeling away the layers of the persona he had relied on for so long. Riley stood beside the captain's car, her hands trembling faintly from the pain still lingering, yet her eyes stayed clear. She did not answer. Brent did not question him, did not counter with words. Her silence pulled even more attention toward her, a cool contrast to unraveling. Her breathing was steady, though her chest still ached with each deeper inhale. She looked at Brent, not with hatred, but with a sharp, calm understanding, as if she had seen his true nature long before this moment. The crowd began murmuring. A woman in the front row gripped her phone and whispered to the person beside her, "I recorded from the start." She never attacked. She stepped back when he moved in. The person next to her nodded firmly, frustration sharp in their eyes. These quiet remarks spread, forming an invisible pressure that pushed Brent further back. The captain scanned the crowd. "Who has footage from the beginning?" he asked. Many hands rose, phones lit, ready to verify every second. Brent looked at them as if watching a net tighten around him. He opened his mouth to speak again, but swallowed the words, knowing the recordings now stood as evidence he could not deny. Marcus Hale stepped forward, again his voice carrying so clearly that the crowd fell quiet. "I saw everything from the start." She did not resist. The words landed like a shield placed between Riley and Brent, a confirmation from someone who had lived through battle. Marcus did not raise his voice, but the certainty in each word cut straight through Brent's excuses. Riley turned to Marcus with a small grateful nod, though she said nothing. Marcus answered with a steady look, a silent promise that he would not allow the situation to be twisted for even one more second. Brent lifted a hand to point at Riley, but the motion was weak, the last flicker of resistance from a man realizing the truth was collapsing the world he had relied on. "You do not understand," Brent said to Marcus, his voice slipping as if it might crack. She moved too fast. Anyone would think she was about to do something. Marcus did not turn toward him. He kept his eyes on Riley and replied slowly, as if speaking to everyone present. "Some people dodge to start trouble," he said. "Some dodge to survive." The line quieted the murmurs for a moment, creating a strange stillness that made Brent seem even more out of place. The captain stepped closer to Brent. "She has been verified," he said, his voice tightening. "Your actions are the issue here." Brent's head dipped for a moment, his shoulders sinking as if the weight of those words pressed directly into his spine. He looked around for support, but found only confusion, anger, and disappointment. Riley watched everything silently. She understood Brent was searching for an exit. Part of her knew that if he pushed further, the situation would only worsen. But she also knew something else. Nothing he said now could undo what had happened. She placed her hand on her ribs, still aching from the pressure earlier, and drew in a long breath. Brent looked at the captain, then at Marcus, and finally at Riley. In that moment, this facet tightened into something difficult to name, caught between anger, humiliation, and fear. "I did not mean to cause harm." The words left his mouth like a last attempt to hold on to something of himself. Riley did not answer. She kept her calm gaze steady, letting silence speak for her. Marcus straightened, his seasoned eyes fixed on Brent, intent on ending the last thread of denial. "You struck her before you knew anything he said. Everyone here saw it." Several people nodded. A man in the back shouted, "She never did a thing from start to finish." The crowd's voice shifted into unity. Brent lost his final foothold. Surrounded by their eyes, he faltered for a few seconds, blinking rapidly as if searching for a way out. But there was none. The entire scene held still, waiting for what came next. And in that moment, Brent Koller understood that his downfall had begun long before he realized it. The air on the street tightened into something heavy as the regional captain scanned the tense faces around him. He stood tall at the center of the circle, his gaze moving from Riley to Brent, then across the crowd as if assessing the full extent of the chaos. Heat rose from the pavement, but his voice stayed steady, almost cold. "Who recorded from the beginning?" he asked, each word striking like metal. Several people raised their hands, but the closest was Evan, the brown-haired young man still holding his phone mid-recording. He stepped forward, nervous but resolute. "I filmed from the moment Mr. Fine ran out until now," he said, his voice shaky. The captain nodded and motioned him closer. Evan opened the video, his hands trembling slightly, though his eyes stayed focused, fully aware that what he held would shape the entire outcome. The screen showed every detail. Riley lifting the dog from the road, Harold Fine shouting, Brent approaching with aggression, then the punch and the takedown. The captain watched without blinking, his expression growing colder. The sounds in the clip grew sharper against the surrounding silence. Brent yelling, Riley's voice strained in pain, the crowd shouting until their voices broke. Several people stared directly at Brent whenever one of his harsher lines echoed from the phone. Evan switched to the live stream still running. The screen displayed a live view of the street, along with a timestamp live 12:14 p.m. Main Street. Viewer numbers climbed every second, comments scrolling nonstop at the bottom. An older woman gasped and covered her mouth when she saw the count jump from a few hundred to nearly 10,000, rising so fast that Evan had to swallow hard. The captain looked at the screen, narrowing his eyes at the time marker. The authenticity was undeniable. He signaled for Evan to zoom in on the moment Brent pinned Riley to the pavement. Evan complied, enlarging every angle, every frame, every sound. The entire street watched the scene again, and this time no one held any doubt about what they were seeing. Brent stepped back once more, his spine pressing against the patrol car as if searching for support. His hand hovered near his belt, but did not grip anything. The confusion on his face was unmistakable. Those who had defended him earlier fell silent, some even lowering their heads to avoid meeting Evan's gaze, or the reality captured in a clip they could not dispute. The captain said nothing extra. He took out his radio, adjusted the channel, and called directly to regional command. His voice was low but firm. "I have reviewed the on-scene evidence. Transfer the video and live stream through the secure line." An officer beside him immediately followed the order, taking Evan's phone to upload everything straight into the verification system. The captain's call was met with a brief crackle over the line. Then the regional commander's voice cut in sharp enough to slice through the silence. "Put the video where I can view it live," he said, firm and urgent, carrying the tone of someone used to handling serious situations. The captain held Evan's phone close to the comm screen. The entire street watched. They could not make out the commander's exact words, but every breath and pause carried the weight of someone evaluating high-risk action. He reviewed the punch, the pin, the moments Riley was forced against the pavement, and the instant the military device slipped halfway out from her bomber lining. For a few stretched seconds, everything wound tight like a wire no one dared touch. Only a child crying from across the street and the wind rattling a porch roof broke the unnatural quiet. Brent swallowed hard, each breath tight, as if standing before a door about to slam shut on his life. The captain kept the phone raised while Riley stood just behind him, her hand resting on her side where the pain lingered. She said nothing, simply watched Brent with a calm, cutting stillness like someone who already knew what was coming. The call lasted barely a minute, but for Brent, it felt like an interrogation. The crowd waited for the verdict, every person holding their breath. The air was so thick it blurred the line between silence and expectation. Then the commander spoke. His voice came through the captain's radio, clear as a seal pressed into wax. Suspend firearm and badge per protocol. Hold the scene. No one responded. The words dropped onto the street like a sentence, tilting the entire space. Brent staggered for an instant, eyes wide in disbelief. The two officers behind him stepped forward, one taken position at his back and the other at his front. Their movements were deliberate and practice drilled into them without a single flaw. The captain faced Brent. "This is a direct order from command. We follow the procedure." Each word shut a door behind Brent. He clenched his hands but did not resist. Not because he accepted the decision, but because the weight of the neighborhood's eyes pressed down on him. One officer extended his hand. Hands up. Brent obeyed, his fingers shaking. The other officer removed the gun from his belt, checked the safety, then placed it into a secure pouch. Brent's badge was lifted from his chest, the motion clean and final. No one smirked or taunted him. Every move was by the book, yet the silence held more force than any insult. Riley watched without satisfaction and without spite. Her face stayed steady despite the pain, as if she were witnessing the inevitable outcome of Brent's choices from the moment he stepped out of the patrol car. The small dog curled against her leg, pressing its head into her pant leg as if trying to reclaim safety after all the chaos. Evan was still live streaming, and the viewer count had passed 20,000. Comments shot up the screen non-stop, alerts chiming as names poured in. People called out Brent's name, Riley's name, talked about the patch, the device, and the verification code. The quiet street had become an online focal point none of them ever imagined. A cold gust swept across the pavement, lifting a thin veil of dust around Brent. He stared at his empty hands as if in that moment he finally understood what he had just lost. The captain stood beside Riley and gave her a small nod, a sign that everything was moving in the right direction. And before most of the crowd had time to react, the captain issued the final order. Hold the scene. Wait for internal affairs. No one spoke. What came next would go far beyond a neighborhood misunderstanding. A new door was opening, but for Brent it opened toward a place he had never been ready to face. Two internal affairs officers approached from the far end of the street and stopped in front of Brent. They spoke only enough to confirm his identity, then signaled for him to follow. Brent glanced around as if searching for an escape, but the crowd held still, their expressions hardened after seeing all the evidence. One officer placed a hand near Brent's arm, not forcing, but clearly overseeing him. Brent swallowed hard, then walked toward the patrol car waiting nearby. Each step dragged the weight of everything that had just been exposed. The car door opened and Brent ducked inside. His face reflected in the glass showed confusion and shock, the complete opposite of the smug confidence he had arrived at. The internal affairs officer shut the door with a firm, final thud, sealing the end of the authority Brent once held. The car rolled slowly toward the station, leaving behind the heavy stares of the residents. Riley was helped up by a female regional officer. She rose slowly but steadily, exhaling in controlled breaths as her back throbbed. The captain signaled to be taken to a nearby medical station for evaluation. Another vehicle arrived. Riley stepped in, leaned back against the seat, and closed her eyes briefly to steady her breathing. Pain ran along her ribs, but she held herself with a composure that earned a quiet look of respect from the officer beside her. The clinic was only a few blocks away. Once inside, a middle-aged doctor examined her quickly. He noted every detail from bruising to compression marks. Riley listened in silence, her expression unchanged, though each time he pressed a sensitive spot, muscles in her shoulder tightened. He concluded she had a mild shoulder strain and deep bruising along her back, but nothing dangerous. He advised her to rest for a few hours to reset her breathing rhythm. The female officer's phone rang. She answered, listened briefly, then stepped closer to Riley. "The military has received the report and is monitoring everything. They are sending a staff attorney to contact you now." Riley nodded, tired but composed. A few minutes later, the room's landline rang. The officer picked up and handed it to Riley. "This is Attorney Alvarez with the military." The man's voice was calm and steady. "I have reviewed all available data and confirm you are protected under the provisions for officers on internal assignment. I need to ask one thing before I file the formal report." He paused, giving Riley a moment to brace. "Do you want to pursue criminal charges yet?" The question cut through the room like a sharp point. The officer lifted her gaze and the doctor paused mid-motion. Riley held the phone close, her eyes dipping slightly as she considered. She knew it was not a question to answer lightly. Her years in service had taught her the weight of prosecuting a police officer, especially in an incident that had already escalated publicly. She placed her hand on the bench, her fingers tightening, then responded in a low, steady voice, "I have not decided yet." Attorney Alvarez did not push her. "I understand. Whatever you choose, we will support you fully. Focus on your medical check first." Riley thanked him and set the phone down. A brief quiet settled in the room, broken only by the steady hum of the air unit. Outside in the hallway, a young nurse walked by, glanced at her phone, then covered her mouth in surprise. She stepped back and whispered to the female officer, "Is that the case of the woman the cop hit on Main Street?" The officer nodded without elaborating. The nurse showed her screen for a second. The live stream views were climbing far beyond anything they expected. When Riley stepped out to rest for a moment, the officer handed her the phone. Evan's live stream had passed 100,000 views. Comments flooded upward, some angry, some worried for Riley, some asking to replay the verification code, others mentioning Brent as a warning about abuse of power. At the bottom was a hashtag spreading at high speed, tying Riley's name to Main Street. Its reach shook the entire neighborhood. Some residents outside were already using it as they reposted the clip. People from nearby blocks walked over to the clinic, forming an unplanned crowd. The captain had to post 2 more officers at the entrance to control the gathering of people wanting to see Riley in person. Riley watched the screen for a few seconds, then handed it back. Her face stayed composed, though a faint ache showed in her eyes. She had seen tense moments in military operations, but being thrust into the public eye like this in civilian life felt entirely different. Part of her wanted the situation to stay quiet so her teammates working covert missions would not face added pressure, but she also knew the incident had already moved beyond her reach. The regional captain entered the clinic. He nodded to the doctor, then approached Riley. "Internal Affairs has been notified. They are at the station preparing to interview Brent." His voice was calm and steady, the tone of someone used to delivering difficult updates. Riley gave a short reply, "I will cooperate fully." The captain nodded, his expression showing a hint of respect. He turned to the female officer. "Stay with her in the restroom. The crowd will grow." Then he stepped out to handle the situation outside. Riley walked into the restroom, sat on the long bench, and felt the ache running from her back to her hip. The officer handed her a cup of water. "Rest. Everything outside is under control." Riley offered a small nod of thanks. Outside the window, layers of voices rolled like waves. The live stream continued spreading across platforms, and the story of Riley Grant and Brent Koller had become something tens of thousands were following by the minute. Riley closed her eyes briefly, taking a slow breath to steady herself. She knew what came next was no longer personal. It had entered the realm of justice media and the classified work she had spent years protecting, and the case born from a misunderstanding at the edge of the street had now moved into a place where nothing could ever return to the way it was. Brent Koller was taken into a temporary interrogation room at the station, the white ceiling light cutting across his face and making the strain and exhaustion even clearer. 2 internal affairs officers sat opposite him, opening digital files and logging every detail. Brent stared at his hands on the table, his fingernails pressing into his skin as if he needed the pain to stay steady. He had just endured a shock at the scene, but he didn't yet understand that what was coming would weigh far heavier. Just as he tried to speak to justify himself, the interrogation room door swung open. A young officer rushed in, phone in hand. "New clip," he said. IA motioned for the phone. The screen showed a shaky phone video from a year earlier. Brent pinning a young man to the ground, barking orders in a harsh tone. It was short, but the excessive force was unmistakable as the man cried out in pain during the final seconds. One investigator looked up. "You remember this one?" Brent tightened his fists, trying to keep his voice steady, but it cracked. He resisted. The investigator held his stare, said nothing, and played another clip a witness had uploaded another street more shouting the same forceful handling. Things Brent believed were buried had resurfaced within hours. Outside, social media was igniting by the minute. People who had run-ins with Brent began posting their stories. One resurfaced claim described him shoving an elderly woman during a paperwork check. Another showed him yelling at a middle school boy of color for riding a bike the wrong way. These clips were old, previously dismissed for lack of evidence or unfiled complaints, but this time the public was different. Inside the interrogation room, Brent heard notification sounds chiming from the hallway, each one striking his nerves like a tap on bone. Tension crawled up his spine as he lost his composure. "You're digging up small things," he shot back. "I've been doing this job for years," the younger investigator replied calmly but with an edge. "The job doesn't excuse losing control over and over." Before Brent could respond, another young officer stepped into the room, his expression tight with a hint of defiance. "I have something," he said, handing over a USB. Brent stared at him, eyes widening. "What did you bring here?" The officer exhaled and looked away. "Your internal emails." The investigators plugged it in. A chain of Brent's messages appeared, including lines mocking people of color and using openly discriminatory language in exchanges with a few close colleagues. The email screen dropped a weight over the entire room. Brent straightened abruptly, snapping. "Those were jokes." The investigator shook his head. "In official communications, that's not a joke." Brent's face flushed, a vein rising at his temple as he searched for a defense. He glared at the young officer who had turned in the evidence, eyes burning with anger and the sting of betrayal. The younger man didn't flinch, holding a steady gaze. "I did the right thing," he said. IA opened an audio file next. Within seconds, Brent's own voice filled the speakers, sharp and unmistakable. It was patrol car audio, him cursing at a group of passing teens using slurs aimed at their skin color. Hearing his own voice echo in the room hit like a hammer. Brent slammed a hand on the table. "Who recorded that?" he shouted. The investigator answered flatly. "An internal camera. It activates automatically when you hit the warning light." The flood of evidence closed in from every direction, stripping away the confidence he usually carried. Brent leaned forward, pressing both hands to his forehead. His breath came short as if the room were shrinking around him, squeezing his ribs a little more each second. Every piece of proof had a timestamp, a location, a trail he couldn't erase. The two investigators exchanged a few brief words, then gathered all the new materials. One flipped a page in his notes, pressing each word as he spoke. "The number of incidents tied to you is higher than we expected." Brent looked up, reaching for composure. "I was doing my job," the investigator replied, voice cold. "Not like this." The door opened again. A senior internal affairs officer stepped inside, his expression the kind that arrived only when the outcome was already clear. He set a file on the table, speaking with clipped certainty. "A formal investigation is now open. We are reviewing your entire career." The words landed like a seal, shutting out the air. Brent froze as if something inside him had locked. His face twitched as he swallowed the shock. Cold sweat gathered his hands, trembling on the tabletop. He understood instantly that this had gone far beyond a street confrontation, beyond a misunderstanding. This was a full-opt audit triggered by what he had done to Riley. The senior investigator repeated it lower but harder. "Your entire career." Brent sagged back in his chair, eyes wide with a dawning, panicked emptiness. He blinked as if trying to clear the words from his mind, but they stayed suspended in the cramped room. In the corner, the security camera kept recording, and Brent Koller sat there, feeling as though the years of his life were being cut apart and set down for judgment. He knew now there was no path back. The door shut behind the investigators, leaving him alone with the final sentence echoing in his head. "Internal Affairs is opening a full investigation into your entire career." Brent sat motionless in the sealed room, the white ceiling light flattening the metal table until the whole place felt stripped of anything human. His hands were laced together, slick with sweat. The silence only made the ticking clock in the corner louder. He had no idea how long he'd been there, only that every passing second felt like a stone dropping onto his chest. The fear he tried to press down kept rising harder each time he forced it away. The door slid open, and Riley stepped inside, moving slowly but steadily, her shoulder tilted slightly from the bandage beneath her bomber. It reminded him of the knee he had driven into her back hours earlier. Riley sat across from him, spine, straight eyes calm in a way that gnawed at him. Not challenging, not pitying, just present in a way impossible to ignore. The investigator behind her switched on the recorder, then stepped back to let them speak. Brent inhaled sharply and launched the first accusation like he was throwing off something crushing him. "You want me to lose everything, don't you?" His voice cracked through the small room, taut and sharp like a wire about to snap. He leaned forward, elbows on the table, staring at Riley as if she were the source of every disaster falling on him now. Anger flickered in his eyes, tangled with a collapse he hadn't admitted. Riley didn't flinch. She exhaled, slowly, evenly, then answered in a low voice, each word falling soft but unshakable. "I want you to be accountable." It wasn't harsh, but it dropped through the room like a weight. She sat steady, rooted in neither accusation nor emotion. Brent felt the sentence slip straight into the parts of him he'd avoided looking at. He fired back with the desperation of someone drowning. "You moved like a military. You made me think you were about to strike. Anyone would think that." He was clawing for a narrative that could pull him out of the hole. His eyes widened as he spoke, as if hoping Riley would argue or slip, giving him something to hold on to. But there was no chaos coming from her to match his. Riley tilted her head slightly, gaze unbroken. "You swung at me before I reacted," she said. "I fixed my jacket because it was pulled out of place. You assumed the worst because people like me always look like a threat to you." Brent bit his lip, and Riley continued, voice steady. "That isn't the reflex of an experienced officer. It's the reflex of someone full of bias." The words pushed him back into the corner he'd been avoiding. A long silence followed while Brent stared down at the table, his hands trembling harder now. He reached for another argument, reaching for anything that might give him a sliver of control. "You moved too fast. I didn't know what was happening," he mumbled. "I've worked 20 years. I know danger when I see it." But his voice had lost its force, thin as thread, and he could feel Riley watching him, seeing straight into the hollow space he had tried so hard to keep hidden. Riley leaned back slightly, her hands clasped loosely on her lap. 20 years, and you still confuse self-defense with aggression," she said. "So what did you do to the people who didn't have those reflexes?" The words weren't loud, but they were sharp enough for Brent to jerk his head up. A spark of anger flickered in his eyes, then died as the memory of every incident resurfaced from the afternoon's revelations. Riley held his gaze without flinching. Brent sank into his chair, his mouth tightening as he'd bitten into something bitter. "You blew this out of proportion," he said, clinging to whatever dignity he believed he still had. "If you'd stayed quiet, if you'd let me do my job, it wouldn't have gone this far." Riley lifted an eyebrow, her expression unchanged. He kept going louder. "I didn't know who you were. I reacted the way any cop would." But as soon as the words left his mouth, he felt them collapse into nothing in a room lined with evidence. Riley braced an elbow on the table and looked directly into Brent's eyes. "No one asked you to know who I was," she said. "You only needed to know I was a civilian and follow procedure. You ignored neutral reports, you believed the worst from a baseless accusation, and you hit someone holding a dog." Brent turned his face aside, jaw locking the sentence, cutting through the last thin layer of excuse he had left. The overhead light cast its shadows across the table, one steady and one frayed. Brent drew a sharp breath, then threw out, "If you weren't military, you wouldn't have a voice to challenge me." The sentence slipped out fast, pure reflex, and the moment it did, he looked like he wished he could pull it back. Riley didn't respond right away. She let the words settle between them as a weight dropped on steel. She straightened eyes, narrowing to a cold line. "If I weren't a SEAL," she said slowly, "what would you have done today?" The question pierced straight into the place he'd avoided. Brent lifted his eyes toward her, but they darted away immediately, as if something inside him was being pulled toward a dark corner he refused to examine. The room shrank into silence, the hum of the vent louder than their breathing. Brent opened his mouth, but only a thin, broken exhale came out. He leaned back, needing the chair behind him to stay upright. The skin around his neck flushed red, his hands curling into weak fists on the metal table. He knew he couldn't dodge the question. Riley held his gaze for one more beat before rising. The investigator opened the door for her, and Brent stayed staring at his trembling hands. He searched for an answer, but nothing formed. All he could see was the small dog, the punch he launched without warning, the look on Riley's face when he drove her into the pavement, and the thought she had left him with chilled him to the bone. If she hadn't been a SEAL, how far would he have gone? The door clicked shut behind her, leaving Brent alone in the washed-out room. The recorder went silent. But Riley's question stayed hanging heavy against the ceiling, waiting for an answer he still didn't have. Brent Koller sat in the internal review room, the same white ceiling lights from years ago casting down on his face as if stripping each layer of emotion. After the conversation with Riley, his mind was a burned-out tangle of wires, yet he forced himself to gather whatever confidence he had left to stand before the Internal Affairs panel. He repeated to himself that everything was a misunderstanding, that he had acted on the instinct of a seasoned officer, that self-defense clung to him like the last life buoy as he stepped into the closed meeting. A large screen lit up at the front. The Internal Affairs officers were seated in a row beneath it. Their eyes were cold and professional, yet Brent felt judgment behind each one. He took a breath and began denying. "I reacted because she showed signs of resistance," he said, voice strained but steady. "I ordered her to stop. She didn't comply. I followed the procedure." The words left his mouth like a replayed recording from 100 past investigations. Internal Affairs didn't respond immediately. They looked at Brent as if testing the strength of every sentence. The commander pressed a button on the desk. The screen shifted to a clip taken from the footage spreading online. Brent saw himself in it, leaning forward, hand clamped on Riley's neck, forcing her against the pavement. The scene was familiar to him, but this time it sent a chill down his spine. He instinctively raised a hand to his face, but still stared through his fingers, unable to believe the stark image playing before him. They slowed the clip, isolating the moment Brent crushed down on Riley's neck. Each passing second cut through the last remnants of conviction he was trying to hold. Riley's face in the footage was tense. Her breath strained her struggle clear enough for Brent to see the victim of his own actions. His complexion drained, his lips losing color, and he gripped the chair to stop the shaking in his body. One investigator looked at him without speaking, but the question was unmistakable in his eyes. "This is what you call procedure." Brent swallowed hard, throat burning as if scraped raw. He searched for a rebuttal, but all that remained was a sound trapped somewhere between chest and mouth. The clip, replayed again, this time zoomed in on his hand pressing into Riley's neck. Guilt crashed over him like a wall collapsing onto his shoulders. He realized his hands were trembling uncontrollably and lowered them to his thighs to steady himself, but his mind only grew heavier. He lifted his head, but couldn't bring himself to look at the screen. His voice cracked. He touched his own face, feeling the chill spreading from bone outward. "I've done that." Brent said, the words landing on the table like shards of something he had hidden for years. He stared into empty space, not at the panel, not at anyone, to a few others. No one believed them. The confession tore away the last layer of armor he had left, leaving him exposed under the harsh white lights. No one responded at first. The silence weighed heavier than any reprimand, shrinking the room around Brent until the walls felt inches from his chest. He couldn't swallow a full breath, his shoulders collapsing as if pressed down by an unseen hand. A young officer in the corner, unable to hide the shock on his face, looked at Brent with a mixture of anger and pity. He stepped forward once, his voice small but steady enough to make Brent flinch. "How many times have you done that?" The question broke through the absolute quiet. No paper rustling, no breath, no tapping pens. It hung in the room like a verdict. The young officer wasn't shouting. His voice trembled as though he himself struggled to believe someone in his own profession could cross that line so many times. The air grew thick, pressing against Brent's ribs with every shallow inhale. Brent looked up at the young officer, eyes wide before narrowing, as if hoping the question wasn't serious. But the directness in the man's stare left no place to hide. Brent's face, tightened lips, pulling together as if holding back something rising inside. His legs went cold, his breath turned sharp and thin. He braced his hands against the table to keep from folding in on himself, but his grip was so weak he felt them slipping against the metal surface. The question jolted loose a chain of memories he had fought for years to bury. The times he pinned someone to the ground, the day he barked at an elderly man for standing in the wrong spot, the moment he grabbed a teenager's collar, simply because the kid reacted faster than he expected. Brent remembered their faces, the resistance, the fear. Everything resurfaced like a flood, hitting a cracked wall, leaving him no strength to rebuild the excuses he once lived behind. A burning heat crawled through his chest. He didn't know what to say or how to face the truth spilling open in front of the entire room. He wondered if he could answer with, "I don't remember," or "I was under pressure," or "it was instinct." But each excuse dissolved before forming words because he knew deep down they would only make him look smaller, weaker, more cowardly. The internal affairs commander crossed his arms, looking at Brent, not with contempt, but with a heavy, almost weary disappointment. Brent had never seen that expression on a superior's face. Sank into him, turning, breathing into labor. The commander spoke slowly, each word steady. "This is no longer an incident. This is a pattern." Brent closed his eyes for 1 second, then opened them again, his gaze hollow, like someone exhausted from running from himself for years. The truth finally crashed over Brent like a storm. His throat tightened, eyes burning without tears. He bowed his head, shoulders slumping forward as if accepting he was standing in the center of his own collapse. No one needed to say another word for him to understand that the career he clung to for 2 decades was breaking apart piece by piece, undone by the very behaviors he had once convinced himself were instinct. Another officer quietly closed his folder, the soft click echoing through the room. To Brent, it sounded like the lid sealing shut on the last doorway of his life. Standing in the center of a room filled with watchful eyes, he knew he had crossed into a new phase of truth, one he no longer had the strength to avoid. When the session ended, no one looked at Brent as a colleague anymore. They looked at him as a lesson to be recorded in the internal files. A painful lesson, a warning that must never be repeated. And Brent bowed his head not out of shame before them, but because he was finally facing himself for the first time in many, many years. The disciplinary chamber on the 2nd floor of the district station was larger than the interrogation room, but no lighter in weight. Rows of seats curved in a half circle, and at the center sat the long table where the council members kept their stern expressions. Brent was escorted and hands hanging at his sides, his steps slow and heavy as if he were walking through deep sand. His mind was a jumble of the internal affairs session earlier, where every layer of defense had been peeled away piece by piece. He lowered himself into the chair for the officer under review, head bowed back, no longer able to hold its usual straight line. The council chair opened the session with a steady, formal voice. He listed the charges under review, from the use of excessive force to the resurfaced evidence of racial discrimination. Each item struck like another blow against the cracked walls of Brent's career. Every time his name was spoken, he felt another piece of weight fall out of him. He wanted to object, wanted to push back, but deep down he knew everything was far beyond his control. The chair's voice stayed even but cold, carrying no trace of mercy. Internal Affairs began presenting evidence. The large screen lit up showing the close-angle footage of Brent choking Riley. Someone exhaled sharply, and a council member frowned at the sight of Riley pinned to the ground. Brent kept his eyes on the table, though the light from the screen kept pulling at him. Each replay made his heart tighten like a fist closing around it. The next clip was from a year prior, showing Brent shoving a young black man on his own porch. No one spoke, but the silence hit harder than any accusation. Brent tried raising his hand to speak, his voice sand dry when he finally did. He explained that he reacted from experience, that the situation moved too fast, and that Riley's quick reflex made him misread her. He tried to steady himself, but heard the tremor in his own words. "I did not intend to hurt anyone," he said, searching the room for even a flicker of understanding. But the council stayed neutral. One member cut back sharply. "Did you react from experience or from bias?" Brent could not answer right away because even he no longer knew where the line was. Internal Affairs moved on to the email submitted by a colleague. A message Brent wrote about black residents in the area made the room shift as if a cold draft had swept through. Brent clenched his fists to stop the shaking. He felt exposed in the center of the panel, each justification ripped away by another document or image. He tried insisting that every officer reaches a breaking point, that the nature of the job shapes reactions. But the more he spoke, the more he felt his words fall into a void, stripped of weight, stripped of belief. When asked to re-watch the clip of Riley slipping past his punch, Brent narrowed his eyes. He saw the brief flash of fear in her gaze, something he had refused to acknowledge at the scene. But here, in this wide and cold hearing room, he realized she had not resisted at all, only reacted to protect herself from an unexpected strike. He drew in a long breath, like someone trying to swallow a stone. With the evidence laid out before him, the justifications in his mind weakened. The chair turned to Internal Affairs. Witness Riley Grant is present. The room shifted subtly as the door opened. Riley walked in with a steady stride, her expression clear despite the traces of exhaustion around her eyes. Her bomber jacket had been replaced, but the white band around her neck reminded everyone of the weight of what happened. She sat in the witness chair, hands on her thighs, eyes not immediately turning to Brent. The counsel asked Riley to recount the events. She spoke calmly, neither raising nor softening her voice. She described rescuing the dog, Mr. Fiend's false accusation, and the way Brent approached with his hand near his holster. She detailed each shove, each shout, each chokehold, but there was no embellishment or bitterness in her tone. She stated the events as someone trained not to let emotion cloud fact. It made the counsel listen more closely. Brent watched her relentlessly, his eyes full of tangled emotions. He remembered the question she had left hanging in the interrogation room, the one he still could not face. Riley ended her account with, "I do not want anyone else to go through what I did." The simple sentence made several council members shift. One frowned slightly, recognizing the weight of her words, concise yet cutting into the core of the case. After a moment, the counsel allowed Brent to question the witness. He turned toward Riley, fingers laced together, trying to hold steady, though a faint tremor shook at his wrists. He looked at her for several seconds as if searching for the exact words, then inhaled. "Am I?" His voice caught. "Am I still a good man?" The room froze. No one expected that question in a disciplinary hearing. The question hung in the air, a silence thick with weight. Riley's gaze rested on Brent's face a heartbeat longer. It held neither pity nor contempt. It looked like the gaze of someone who had seen too many dark corners of humanity to be surprised anymore. The counsel remained silent as well, letting the question fall on the table and spread like ink. Riley did not answer. She looked at Brent for a long moment, as if considering something larger than the question itself. The chair signaled a recess so the counsel could deliberate. The door opened, and Riley was guided back to the waiting room. But Brent remained in his seat, eyes following her until her silhouette disappeared through the doorway. Inside him, the question echoed, not truly asked of Riley, but of himself. And that question, unanswered, left a heavy stillness in the chamber as they prepared to move into the final decision. Riley sat in the small waiting room of the precinct, where a few chairs lined the wall and an old water dispenser hummed in the corner. The warm, yellow light caught her face, making the faint bruise along her neck stand out even more. She sat upright, eyes fixed on the empty space ahead, as if ordering each event of the day into place. Everything had stretched longer than she expected, from the first contact with Brent to the disciplinary hearing where he asked a question that left the room silent. Riley folded her hands over her knees, head bowed slightly as if listening to her own breath. The door swung open. The investigator invited Riley back into the hearing room. The council members were already seated, none showing a discernible expression. Brent remained in his previous seat, his body pitched forward like someone unsure where to set his emotions. Riley stepped in and paused for a few seconds before sitting. The air held the gray heaviness of waiting of words about to be spoken, but not yet fully accepted by anyone present. The chair thanked Riley for her cooperation and explained that they were deliberating the next steps. He asked if she had anything further she wished to state. Riley looked at him, then at Brent. His face was tense, no defiance left, only a suspended mix of despair and anticipation. Riley smoothed the edge of her jacket, drew a long breath, and spoke. "I do not want to break you," Riley said, her voice steady and clear. There was no tremor, no bitterness, but no softness that could blur the meaning. The room halted. Brent lifted his head, staring at her as if he could not believe the first words she chose to say. Riley continued, her eyes holding a restrained sharpness, but not cold. "I want you to relearn how to be a person." She let the sentence fall naturally, not emphasized, yet heavy enough for everyone in the room to feel its weight. Brent pressed his lips together, his hands tightening. Riley's words struck directly at the part he tried hardest to hide. He understood she was not speaking to gain forgiveness or ease the hearing. She spoke because it was the truest thing she saw in him, and the truth he had never admitted to himself. A few council members lowered their heads as if in agreement, because her words targeted not just a man, but the pattern that had shaped an entire system. The chair asked whether Riley had any further requests regarding disciplinary action or prosecution. Riley exhaled softly as someone making a final calculation. "I want the truth recorded in the file," she said. "I want him held accountable. I want someone reading these reports later to know this happened." Her voice stayed, even though carrying the fatigue of someone who had endured too much in one day. "But I do not want to carve this into someone's life forever if there is still a way for them to come back." Brent sat still, as if cut away from the air around him. His knuckles trembled when he loosened his hands, as though trying to rediscover the shape of himself beneath the layers of excuses. He lowered his head, further shoulders sinking into a posture Riley had never seen on him, a silence that was real, not a pause for counterattack or calculation, but the silence of someone hearing the final word from the side that was right. The room grew so quiet that they could hear a sheet of paper shift between two council members. Then the phone on the table vibrated softly. The chair lifted a brow at the caller ID, then looked up and said, "Lieutenant Colonel Reed requested to speak to Riley directly." The room fell still as the speaker activated Reed's voice, coming through calm and clear. "Grant, I have reviewed the full report and the footage. Thank you for staying composed in a situation no one would want." Riley bowed her head slightly, answering briefly to confirm she was listening. Reed continued, "Not everyone in that position could keep a coherent mind. I'm proud of you." Reed's voice was steady, not loud, but carrying in enough weight to lift a person's spine. Brent heard every word like hearing the last light in a room he had trapped himself in. Reed did not speak of Brent, nor of punishment or investigation. He spoke only of Riley, of her ability to hold the principle while everything spun out of control. That alone drew a sharp line between them, one who had lost direction and one who stayed upright under every layer of pressure. When the call ended, Riley leaned back slightly, as if Reed's words had given her the final strand of affirmation she needed. The chair turned to her once more. "Your decision regarding criminal charges," he said, not pressing, but seeking clarity. Riley looked at Brent, not avoiding, not harsh, simply steady, like water settling after a storm. "I am not filing criminal charges." The sentence made the whole room shift. A few council members lifted their heads. Others glanced at Brent to read his reaction. Brent froze his chest, rising in faint, uneven breaths as though he had just crossed out of deep water. No one in the room knew what Riley was thinking but Riley herself. She did not add an explanation because she understood that actions carried more weight than justifying them. The chair asked again for confirmation. "You are certain of this decision?" Riley nodded. "I want every record kept accurate. I want every wrong handled through proper procedure. But I do not want revenge." Her voice was steady and seasoned, and those seated around her could feel that this choice was not softness or leniency. It was the choice of someone who had lived through battle, someone who understood the weight of punishment and the weight of leaving a path for a person to stand back up again. Brent kept his head bowed, but his fingers slowly eased as if a small space had just opened inside him. He did not look up yet. The tightness in his shoulders began to loosen. He was living in a moment where his silence meant more than every explanation he had tried before. He did not say thank you, did not apologize, because he knew the time for those words had not arrived. For now, all he could do was receive the decision from the woman he had hurt and nearly pushed into mortal danger. The hearing paused as the council stepped into a private room to deliberate. Riley stood and moved to leave. When she walked past Brent, he did not lift his head, but his body shifted back slightly, a reflex of someone trying not to disturb another person, something he had rarely done before. It was a small distance, but a meaningful one, enough for Riley to recognize the first change after everything that had unfolded. The door closed behind Riley, leaving Brent alone in the wide, silent room where each breath echoed faintly. He did not know what the council's decision would be, but he knew something more certain than any punishment. From the moment Riley said, "I want you to relearn how to be a person," his life had turned a page. And that page was still blank, carrying no words yet, but to Brent it was a last chance. The afternoon settled over the town in a pale wash of light. The rows of red brick buildings stretching along the street given the place a familiar but heavy feel after the incident with Riley and Brent. At the community center, dozens of residents had gathered in the large room with wooden floors and old ceiling fans. The front board carried the words "emergency meeting" on neighborhood safety chairs were lined in rows far more filled than at any usual meeting. Some faces were tense, some anxious, but most carried determination. Brent's actions had stirred something they had all sensed for years but never dared to speak aloud. Riley entered quietly through the back door and chose the last seat near the corner away from the direct lights. She did not want attention, did not want the meeting to become a debate about her. Her jacket was neat enough to hide the fading bruise on her neck. She stayed silent, hands folded on her lap, eyes toward the podium. Her breathing was slow and steady, as if preparing for another military briefing, even though the people around her were ordinary residents. An older man stepped forward. He was the head of the neighborhood council, his voice low but clear. "We are here because what happened this week is no longer an isolated incident," he said. People nodded instinctively, as if his words matched their own thoughts. "This is not just about Riley Grant, but about all of us." As he finished, Riley felt a few glances shift toward her. She kept her posture unchanged, neither lowering her eyes nor showing discomfort. She knew this meeting needed honesty. A middle-aged woman rose from the third row. "Brent shoved my son against our garage wall because he walked home from the stadium a bit late," she said, her voice shaky but growing stronger. "I thought my boy was wrong because I trusted the police. Now I see I was looking the wrong way." People turned to each other, some covering their mouths in shock. Truth began to spark from different corners. Separate beams forming a clearer shape of a problem long ignored. Another man, a former serviceman named Malloy, stood to speak next. He clasped his hands in front of him, bowing his head briefly. The way Brent talked to Riley that day, I've seen it on the battlefield where people treat the other side like objects. He paused to steady himself, then continued. It wasn't the first time I saw him act that way toward people of color in this area. I never had proof, but now we do. The room fell into a heavy silence, the sort that comes when a respected voice confirms what many feared. From her corner, Riley felt each statement marking pieces of what this community had endured but never spoken aloud. She neither nodded nor shook her head, simply watched with a quiet gaze. She understood the weight of these testimonies went far beyond her own decision not to press criminal charges. This was the community choosing to confront its own fractures. And Riley, though, at the center of the storm, sat still and listened as part of the change now beginning to unfold. Mrs. Johnson, who lived across from Mr. Fine, stood with a trace of anger still on her face. That day I saw Riley carrying that little dog off the street. She saved it, and we still let Harold talk however he wanted and let Brent charge in like he was arresting a criminal. Her voice caught as she said it. I blame myself. I stood there and said nothing. A few people lowered their heads, not out of shame toward her, but because they saw themselves in her words. A young man at the back raised his hand. Brent once pulled me over because I was driving a car he didn't think someone like me would afford. I stayed quiet because I had no proof. He looked around the room, his eyes settling on Riley. But now I see none of us should stay quiet anymore. His words warmed the room like a thread connecting those who had silently endured with the person who had just faced violence. Riley felt those words carried more strength than any resistance in a chaotic day. This was resistance born from shared memory, a community standing up to correct itself. It eased the heaviness that had followed her since morning. She tilted her head slightly to take everyone in her eyes, calm but touched with a clearer light. She no longer felt alone in this room, even though she was the only one who had directly borne Brent's force that the neighborhood resident concluded with a firm voice. We need to file a petition to review every case Brent handled. The room agreed, almost as one. And we need to make sure this never happens to anyone again. He looked around, letting his gaze pause on Riley. No one deserves to be treated like that. No one. The chorus of agreement that followed was stronger and sharper than at any meeting before. Riley stayed seated, but something in her chest felt as if it opened. Not out of triumph nor satisfaction, but the feeling of watching a community grow after a hard collision. She loosened her fingers from their clasp on her lap and drew a slow breath to take in the room's atmosphere. The respect directed toward her did not come from her being a sa-seal-lut from what she did that day or from standing up even when she was forced down. When the meeting ended and people rose from their seats, many glanced toward Riley, not with curiosity or doubt, but with gratitude. A woman offered a small smile as she passed, a man gave a respectful nod, and a young man pressed a hand to his chest in acknowledgement. Small gestures, but genuine, carried in looks that needed no explanation. Riley rose and stepped outside, letting the meeting room door fall shut behind her. The evening wind moved through the walkway in front of the community center, carrying a quiet coolness that felt like change settling in. She paused by the railing and looked down at the street where she had stood days earlier amid shouts and suspicious eyes. Today that same street was calm, and the respect the community now held for her settled deeper in her than any medal ever could. In that moment, Riley understood that not every battle is fought on a battlefield. Some are fought inside a community where courage is not measured by fists or footsteps, but by the choice to stand up and change what people once accepted as normal. And today, she realized she was not fighting alone. Riley stepped out into the parking lot beside the community center where the late-day light stretched long across the asphalt and the trees cast thin shadows on the ground. The space was quieter than it had been during the meeting, now filled only with the sound of wind moving through leaves and the distant hum of fading traffic. She walked slowly toward her car, her mind still echoing the things the residents had said. Her shoulders felt lighter, as if the last weight of responsibility had finally been shared with the community she had just watched rise together. As she opened her car door, she heard footsteps approaching from behind. Brent stopped a few meters away, his frame smaller than it had seemed in the days before. His shirt was creased the collar, undone a sign that he hadn't bothered with the careful precision he once lived by. His face looked worn, stripped of the rigid posture and hardened gaze he usually carried. He stood there for several seconds, as if unsure whether he even had the right to step closer. When Riley turned to face him, he drew in a long breath to steady himself. He took one step forward, his voice low and unsteady. "I'm sorry, honestly." The words were simple, but when they left him, they felt heavy enough to stop him mid-breath. His eyes didn't hold hers for long, dropping to the ground again and again, like someone confessing to the one person who had the authority to pass judgment. His fingers tightened together to keep from shaking. His expression showed that the apology wasn't meant to salvage a career, but to salvage whatever part of himself still remained. Riley stood with her back straight, her gaze calm. She watched him for a few seconds, taking in every small shift in his expression, then spoke with a quiet, steady clarity. "Apologize to the people you hurt." It wasn't rejection, and it wasn't accusation. It placed Brent exactly where he needed to be, neither elevated nor condemned, just faced with the truth that she wasn't the only one he had harmed. Brent blinked as if her words had cut through the last layer he had used to shield himself. He lifted his head, though his eyes remained subdued, holding no defiance, only the raw weight of understanding. "I know," he said, his voice thick, "and I will." He didn't promise redemption or transformation, didn't claim he would change overnight. He spoke plainly, and Riley recognized it as the first honest tone she had ever heard from him. It eased the tension between them just slightly. In that moment, Brent nearly folded in on himself. His shoulders dropped, his back lost its practiced straightness, and his face revealed the exhaustion of a man who had weathered a storm, only to realize the first force that wrecked him had been himself. He swallowed hard and added, "I don't expect you to forgive me now. I just want to start somewhere." He looked at Riley, then for real this time, without anger or edge, only a stark emptiness that was painfully human. Riley didn't answer right away. She looked down at the ground between them where a few small leaves were scattered. She thought of the people who had stood up during the community meeting, of the stories that had gone unspoken for years because no one believed they would be heard. She thought of how Brent once held power and used it the wrong way, and how he now stood at the point where he had to face the consequences himself. When she lifted her head, her voice was calm but firm enough that Brent listened. "I don't have the right to forgive on anyone's behalf," she said, "but you can apologize to them and do better." Her words weren't guidance so much as placing the responsibility back where it belonged. Brent nodded again, deeper this time, like someone hearing the thing he had hoped for but never dared to request. He didn't say anything else, knowing that any promise now would risk sounding empty. His silence became the strongest commitment he could offer. A light breeze picked up, moving a few strands of Riley's hair. She studied Brent for a long moment, as if wanting to remember the face of the man standing before her, not the face of the officer who had attacked her on the street, but the face of someone learning how to rise from his own mistakes. Riley neither stepped forward to reassure him nor backed away to build distance. She stayed exactly where she was, far enough to feel safe, close enough to acknowledge him. Brent stepped back, his head dipping slightly. He seemed unsure how to end the conversation, like someone encountering a kind of uncertainty he had never allowed himself to feel. Riley waited for him to find the words or the gesture to close the moment. After a few seconds, he spoke softly, almost like an exhale. "I'll take responsibility from now on." He looked at Riley one last time, his eyes carrying resolve, but also the fear of the road ahead. Riley gave a small nod, clear enough for him to see, but not given reluctantly. She took hold of her car door, opened it, and paused before stepping in. "Good," she said, her voice just loud enough for him to hear. Sometimes that's the first step. Brent lowered his eyes at her words, not out of shame, but because he recognized how true they were, truer than any advice he had ever been given. He turned away, walking slowly toward the empty stretch of the parking lot. They moved in opposite directions without looking back, without a farewell. Yet, the air between them felt lighter than when they began. The path Riley followed toward the exit carried the steady resolve of someone who had come through a hard fight. The path Brent took in the other direction carried the heavy steps of someone beginning again from the rubble he had created. In that distance, their silence was not separation, but a sign of two necessary diverging journeys. Above them, the evening light began to spill across the city, tinting the rooftops with a pale gold. Riley glanced at the sky once before getting into her car. For her, the battle of that day had closed. For Brent, it had only just begun. And when her car door shut, it left behind the first step of an apology finally pointed in the right direction. Brent Koller sat in the records office, a long room lined with shelves that reached the ceiling, the light dimmer than the patrol wing he once knew. Every file he opened carried the scent of old paper mixed with ink, a smell that reminded him of his first days as a rookie. But this time he didn't touch them with the eagerness of someone learning the job, only with the quiet weight of someone removed from the front line. He stacked each file with mechanical motions, realizing his hands carried no power, now only a muted sense of responsibility. Each time the door cracked open, Brent felt his heart jolt, a reflex of someone unused to being watched. Footsteps in the hall sounded foreign, as if the entire building had moved into a new era and he had been left behind. He tried to focus, but Riley's face rose in his mind every time he handled paperwork from cases he once led. He reread his own reports and saw every flaw he used to bury under misplaced confidence. Now, each page felt like a lesson he was required to finish. Meanwhile, Riley was returning to the SEAL base after days of resolving matters with local police. From a distance, the steel gates rose with bright security lights that gave the familiar sense of stability she needed. As she walked through, two guards greeted her with crisp salutes, their eyes both strict and welcoming. She returned the gesture and moved into the inner compound where training halls and open fields echoed with steady footfalls. The constancy of the base eased something inside her. The hallway toward the common room carried voices and easy laughter from her teammates. When Riley entered, the noise dipped for half a second before warming again. Torres, one of her closest friends, stood up and approached her, tall and solid, his eyes carrying real concern. "You good?" he asked, low and direct. There were no courtesies between them, only the bluntness of people who had faced death side by side. Riley set her pack on the table, rolled her shoulders slightly, and answered. "I'm fine," she said, "but the country isn't." Her words dropped into the room with a weight that silenced everything for a beat. Torres held her gaze, then nodded, understanding her without needing more. The others looked over as well, their eyes filled not with pity, but acknowledgement. They knew she had just come from a different kind of fight, one without rifles or hidden enemies, but one that carried its own kind of damage. Riley left the room and walked down the hall toward the outdoor training field. The late sun washed the ground in pale gold, sliding across obstacle lanes, rope towers, and the flat sand that had taken the imprint of countless brutal drills. A light breeze moved the American flag on the tall pole, its soft sound clear against the stillness. Riley stopped at the entrance, her hand resting on the cold metal rail. She took in the familiar sight before her, feeling her thoughts slow after days of relentless tension. Groups of young soldiers trained in the distance, their steps sharp and their cadence steady. Riley watched them, feeling as if she were looking at an old version of herself. She had once believed the world outside would be fine as long as she did her job well, but what happened last week had shown her that strength wasn't only born on the battlefield, it lived in the way people treated one another in everyday life. She thought of Brent, of the collapse in his expression when he finally understood the weight of what he had done. Riley leaned back lightly against the rail, letting the wind thread through the loose strands of hair along her shoulder. Her eyes settled on an empty section of the field. The place where she had trained to bear impact had fallen and had stood up hundreds of times. Every drill there had been meant for combat, yet her confrontation with Brent had been something no curriculum prepared for. It had required calm discipline and a measure of humanity qualities the military shaped in different ways, but that civilian life demanded just as urgently. Footsteps approached softly as Torres came up behind her. He didn't speak at first, simply stood beside her looking over the field. "Feel like jumping back into training already?" he asked, half teasing, half earnest. Riley shook her head, a faint, rare smile touching her lips. "Not yet," she said. "I need a moment to gather myself." Torres nodded and walked off, leaving Riley alone with the wide expanse ahead. She stood there, feeling the solidity of the ground beneath her and the open sky above. She knew the fight with Brent was done, but the larger one against prejudice and abuse of power was far from over. Riley didn't believe she could fix everything, but she knew she had helped open a door that allowed the community to see what had been hidden. And in that moment, watching the training field glow under the evening light, she understood she had chosen the right way to stand her ground. Riley drew in a deep breath, the wind carrying the blended scent of metal earth and sun grounding her. She turned and walked slowly back toward the main building, knowing tomorrow would bring another day, another set of duties. But inside her was a new conviction that change did not come only from the military or the police, but from the awakening of individuals. And that conviction, fragile but steady, was enough to keep her upright in a world that needed people like her to hold the balance. Riley Grant returned to her old neighborhood on a late afternoon, the fading gold sunlight resting over low rooftops and the trees trembling softly in the breeze. There were no sirens, no chaotic noise like the day of the incident, only the quiet that usually settled over a small residential block. She parked by the curb, turned off the engine, and sat still for a few seconds, letting the air of this place touch her memory again. Even though everything had passed, the street still held a mark inside her like a folded corner in a book that would never smooth out fully. Riley opened the door and stepped out, her breath slowing as she took in the view around her. Harold Fine's house stood at the end of the row, still with its white fence and the small flowers he always tended with care. The gate quivered lightly as the wind moved through it, the sound soft like a polite knock. Riley walked toward it at an unhurried pace, her heels tapping a low tone on the concrete that made the small dog lift its head in surprise. It stood inside the fence, its dark round eyes widening before it bounded forward as if recognizing her. There was no shouting now, no suspicion, only a small creature excited to greet the person who had saved it from danger. The dog rushed to the fence, its tail wagging like a trembling little fan in the wind. Riley crouched, held her hand close, and the dog immediately licked her fingers, its happy panting barely audible. The moment was the opposite of the chaos that day, when a single misunderstanding could twist a good deed into a reason to accuse. Riley looked at the dog, her eyes softening. "You got lucky that time," she murmured, more like a quiet confession than a scolding. The dog tilted its head, ears drooping, then pressed its face against the fence as if replying. A moment later, the front door opened and Harold Fine stepped outside, his movement slow, but his eyes clearer than when she had last seen him. When he noticed Riley, he paused, a flicker of unease crossing his lined face. He looked at the dog, wagging happily at the fence, then at Riley with a cautious gaze, though the tension from before was gone. "You're the girl from the other day," he said, his voice small and slightly embarrassed. Riley straightened and gave a slight nod, carrying no intention of blame. She understood that fear and bias could push people into needless reactions. Mr. Fine walked closer to the fence, glancing at the dog before looking back at Riley. "I overreacted," he said. "I thought you were running off with him. I didn't see clearly," Riley answered in a steady tone, free of bitterness. "You were worried about him, so you misunderstood me." "I get that," she said. The reply seemed to ease him, his shoulders dropping as his aged hand gently stroked the dog's head. He drew in a slow breath as if trying to wash away what he had unknowingly set in motion that day. A neighbor happened to walk by, recognized Riley, and stopped. Their eyes held a mix of caution and curiosity before shifting into a clear respect as they remembered who she was. Others around the block began watching her with a different attitude, too. Not suspicion, but gratitude that she had not escalated things further. Riley sensed it, though she refused to sink into the feeling of being honored. She had not come here for recognition, but to close what had been left unfinished. The breeze stirred again, carrying the rustle of leaves as Riley slowly took in the street where everything had once erupted. There had been shouting here, recording phones, panicked voices, and Brent's anger echoing across the pavement. All of it had faded into the past, but the echo remained like a lesson everyone needed to remember to avoid repeating. Riley knew change would not come overnight, but what had happened was enough to make this neighborhood rethink the way it reacted to difference. She stepped closer to the fence, gently brushing dust from the dog's head, its warm softness drawing a faint smile from her. "You're safe now," she said. The dog answered with a small carefree bark, as if it had no memory of its owner shouting when he saw Riley pulling it away from an oncoming car. It did not understand, but its innocence was enough to ease her mind after the long stretch of defending herself against false accusations. Mr. Fiend watched her, took a slow breath, and said something Riley never expected him to put into words. "Thank you for that day," he said. "If it weren't for you, I might have lost him." Riley looked at him, her eyes calm. "I did what anyone would do," she replied. He shook his head. Not everyone would do it with that kind of composure. Not after being misunderstood. His words made Riley feel that the distance between them had finally been bridged by truth instead of fear. Riley stepped back, taking in the street once more as if committing its final image to memory. The walls, the pathways, the eyes that had once turned toward her with doubt now changed. She sensed a slow shift in a community that had just learned a lesson from its own mistakes. A punch had once landed here, but from that punch came the unavoidable push for people to face the issue they had long avoided. When Riley turned away and walked toward her car beneath the shade of a tree, she felt a kind of relief she had not known in days. It was the feeling of ending a story, not with retaliation, but with understanding difficult, but truer to who she was. Looking up at the sky changing colors, Riley understood that nothing that happened here had been meaningless. It had changed. A street shaken a system and awakened a group of people. She opened the door, sat behind the wheel, and before starting the engine, glanced at the rear-view mirror one last time. The image of the little dog, wagging its tail by the fence, blended with the evening light into a rare moment of peace. Riley murmured softly into the air, "One punch can hurt a person, but the truth laid bare can change an entire city." And with that sentence, she drove away from the neighborhood, leaving behind a lesson that would be remembered for a very long time. Riley Grant left the quiet street in the calm of late afternoon, but the story that had unfolded still felt like warm ash smoldering beneath the surface. From the moment she lifted the little dog out of the path of the car to the instant the security clearance code crackled through the radio, everything had fallen like a line of dominoes, beginning with a misunderstanding and ending in a truth that forced an entire community to face itself. Brent Koller had rushed at her with the confidence of someone convinced that power always stood on his side. Harold Fine had accused her out of a vague fear, and the neighbors had attached Riley as if she were a question mark. Yet, those pieces all shifted in ways no one predicted, revealing a larger picture about how people react when confronted with what they perceive as different. The confrontation between Riley and Brent had never truly been a clash of two individuals, but of a woman holding on to calm and a man driven by the instincts of his own prejudice. When Brent crushed down on her throat amid the shouting crowd, Riley's response was not hatred, but the trained instinct of someone who had faced real enemies on actual battlefields. And when Marcus Hale, seasoned and steady, spoke up, every gaze turned with him. His words, simple and direct, became the first steady knock that woke the people watching. From there, the story broke out of the mold of a street dispute and became a mirror reflecting the haste with which many had judged. Riley never wanted to reveal her identity because she knew justice was built not on rank or title, but on right and wrong. Yet, when the device slipped from her jacket and the encrypted code came through, the truth had to be laid bare. Her identity was not a weapon against Brent, proof that he had judged wrongly from the start. If she had not been a SEAL, if she had not carried a verification code, if Marcus had not spoken up, the situation might have veered into far more dangerous territory. That realization forced many in the neighborhood to ask themselves how often they had looked at someone with suspicion without any real reason. When Brent was placed under investigation, when old clips surfaced and co-workers began speaking about things they had stayed silent about for years, the truth peeled back layer by layer to show that abuse of power never appears in a single day. It begins in the ease of a dismissive tone and a frown at someone unfamiliar, in the silence of witnesses who do not want to get involved. With each piece of evidence, Brent had fewer places to hide. The moment he saw himself choking Riley on the screen was the moment the arrogant armor he wore collapsed entirely. Riley had chosen a different path, one not everyone would have the courage to walk. She had the right to press charges, yet she did not choose revenge. She wanted Brent to face the truth, to walk the full road of accountability instead of being dragged by the anger of the crowd. That decision did not make her soft but strong in a quieter way, as a soldier who knows real victory lies in choosing the right battles. When Brent bowed his head to apologize, Riley did not forgive him instantly, but she gave him a chance many others never received. The community changed as well. At the neighborhood meeting, old stories surfaced awkward, apologies followed, and the way people looked at Riley shifted into respect. No one likes to admit they were wrong, but that was what gave the story meaning. People began to understand that awareness does not come from quick glances, but from careful observation. Empathy does not grow in shouting, but in the still moments when they see someone treated unfairly. The greatest lesson Riley carried did not lie in military authority or the presence of a verification code. It lies now that one small action can spark a storm if people let prejudice take the lead. It lies in thoughtless, even when late still has the power to cleanse. It lay in how a calm woman in a terrible moment could make the neighborhood reflect itself. And most of all, it lay in the belief that every community has the chance to be better as long as it has the courage to face the truth. Riley left quietly, but the echo of what happened remained in every house, every glance, every small decision made by those who witnessed it. Not everyone would change immediately, but everyone had been awakened, and that was enough to make her journey a milestone, not loud, but profound. In a world still filled with injustice, sometimes it takes only one person standing steady in the storm to remind everyone that justice never arrives on its own. It is built by those willing to face it and willing to change.